Hello and welcome here to the next session of our Mars webinar. It's Thursday, February 25th, 2021. And as always, at the last Thursday of the month at 9 p.m. here in Germany, we have our webinar about topics for market access and reimbursement. My name is Lutz Wulmer and I'm your moderator for tonight's webinar. So just before we come to our topic about the Wonderland Switzerland and early paid access, let me give you some general informations. So who is Mars or what is Mars? Mars is the German-speaking market access expert for your topics, which are price and reimbursement strategies, reimbursement submissions, so all the paperwork for the German Federal Joint Committee, for the new DiGA Fast Track, for the Swiss BAG or the Austrian Hauptverband. And also, of course, we support you with price negotiations and health economic calculations for Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. And of course, please check out our new virtual reality bootcamp here. So we had made something really nice for some clients just to train you for face-to-face price negotiations, just to interact and how to interact and train you a little bit and prepare you a little bit better with a probably better result at the end. So, and as always, check out, here you have the possibilities to ask questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them either in the chat here function or use the question and answer function here in Zoom. We will, after the presentation, we will have time for your questions. And as always, and that's always the first questions, do you publish the slides? Yes, we will do. And we also publish the videos. Check out on our website, which is www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de. And here you find at the banner on the top, the webinars, where you find, for example, the last one, the Digital Rocks, about the DiGA Pros Fest with our good colleague from the other side, from the digital health insurance side of MyWild. And if also you find all the others webinars we produced over time, some really good ones about COVID or the DiGA applications are there, or EU HTA. So check that resource out. But now let's come tonight and welcome you, please, the speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Stefan Walzer. Dr. Stefan Walzer, who is the founder and CEO of Mars. Stefan is the health economist with a long career in market access at Roche. Welcome to Weil am Rhein, which is just across the border to Basel. Welcome, Stefan.
Good evening, Lutz. Good evening, everybody. Hi, Remo.
And also tonight we have a special guest. Stefan already introduced our good friend Remo Christen joined us. Remo is the Director of Market Access and Healthcare Affairs at Roche, Switzerland. Welcome, or as the Swiss people say, Grüezi nach Basel, Remo.
Hello together, Grüezi.
Wonderful that you're here and you're joining us tonight. We will have a fun webinar about alps, cheese, and banks. And Stefan, now coming to the title, and early paid access with that calculation, is Switzerland the Wonderland, Stefan?
Let's now just see. I think, thank you for the introduction, Lutz. As always, thank you also, Remo, for joining. And I think you will also have, obviously, the opportunity after my kind of, maybe call it introduction, summary, or whatever, into the Swiss way of market access, to also then go a bit further into the details. So, cool question, obviously, before we start with the kind of, let's say, more detailed analysis around reimbursement and market access. Clearly, I mean, what is Switzerland, right? We have put in there Alps. Yes, that is what everybody knows. We've put in there cheese, and I also like fondue, but I think also Switzerland has a lot of more to provide. And I think we now pick just some of that out, which is obviously focusing a bit on the healthcare system. I think overall, also, if you go into the literature, for example, also if you check, for example, different kind of analysis, also reviews or researches across the population Switzerland, I think generally, I think the Swiss health system is being seen and perceived as good to, I think, very good, but comparatively expensive. We'll see and we don't have a lot of, let's say, details on that part, on the comparative or comparatively kind of expensive part, but I think it might also be maybe a kind of good question for after the presentations, maybe also to Remo, when we come to the pricing side of the whole kind of reimbursement exercise. But before we start with that, I mean, just to give a bit of a frame, right? I mean, Switzerland has, I've just learned this evening, 8.7 million people as a population. So just to give as well there a bit of a perspective, it's a rather kind of smaller country around Europe. It's not part of the European Union, but it is part of Europe, obviously. And as already said, according to, for example, the OECD, Switzerland has one of the world's best and most expensive healthcare systems. Around 11% of the healthcare expenditures per gross domestic product is basically being spent by private expenditures, which is comparatively high when taking different European countries as well in comparison. I think the only other country, at least the numbers I have in mind, which has similarly high numbers is the US. Moving a bit further into the direction of market access, and I think everybody who is obviously following or in the details of the market access reimbursement pathway knows exactly, I mean, if you want to have a kind of efficient system for market access, you also need an efficient or quite efficient healthcare system in general. I think we'll not go through the different parts in here, but I think maybe also important in there as well. I mean, there is obviously, let's say, some more kind of national, federal kind of institution, but it's also going down to the cantonal and also to the communal, which is then the local kind of government, which have as well some kind of, let's say, important kind of says and as well decisions to be made in the healthcare system. But moving further, there are different tariff systems available in Switzerland. And we're as well just, let's say, going into the kind of more details a bit later from a drugs perspective. So that is also why we maybe start first with some other parts in here. There's for the inpatient cases, there's the Swiss DRG, which is, I think, quite similar to the German DRG. So it's a fixed lump sum for the services being provided in the inpatient or hospital setting. There's then the outpatient setting, which is primarily being regulated by the so-called TAMED, which is just a tariff list, which is then as well regulating the reimbursement and the cost side in the outpatient setting. And there's also then the so-called NEGAL list, which includes remedies and devices as well. And we touch base on that as well in a couple of seconds. That's not all of the, let's say, tariffs available. There are also various other kind of tariffs or lists available. I think there's a list of analysis, a specialty list, which is then the drug list. I think that's maybe as well important later on, and also the rehabilitation and the psychiatry. Starting then a bit with the DRG system, which is then the one we have just said for the inpatient setting. Also, this one is very much structured according to what we know, for example, also from Germany. I think there is a way to submit, for example, new kind of, in this way, we've just in there included there, for example, approved therapies, approved drugs for which are also being used in the inpatient setting. But this is the same then for the procedures. So if you want to be used, or if the product should be used in the inpatient setting, quite clearly there needs to be somewhere a kind of reimbursement in the inpatient setting. And quite clearly there's sometimes as well the kind of issue that maybe the DRG value itself, so the reimbursement amount, does not cover, for example, especially new procedures and or new drug therapies. And that is also when there's also quite clear kind of process available in order to get some kind of additional funding available in some circumstances. That's as well something to be checked for. I've just mentioned as well, I mean, for the Swiss DRG, but there's also quite clearly generally the kind of question, how do, for example, medical devices getting into the reimbursement system? Overall, and we have as well as a special slide then later on as well for the drug part, the Swissmedic is the entrance door into the Swiss healthcare market. There's also the opportunity, that's maybe as well an important consideration, an early consultation possible, especially, for example, for the definition of the so-called reference product. So it's basically the kind of comparator, right, which needs to be potentially as well included in the evidence base for a new, in this case, device. Important here is also quite clearly the CE mark is also being accepted in the Swiss environment. And we have as well just mentioned the different kind of lists on the right-hand side, which I have as well just introduced a couple of minutes ago in the outpatient sector, namely mentioned TAMED, NIMIGL, and the analysis list. Most important, and that is also where I personally think the Swiss system, especially for medical devices, is probably a more pragmatic kind of system when compared to some of the other countries and other processes and systems available, at least across Europe. First of all, and the core kind of question for the next kind of steps in here is really, is it a new, is it a modified, or is it a so-called controversial kind of new product? If that is not the case, so meaning it's not new, it's not modified, or it's not controversial. So it's, for example, a Me Too. I think the pathway is quite simple. If it's not controversial, controversial is, I think, a bigger kind of terminology, right? But the controversially or the controversy is especially starting quite clearly with the so-called economic question, right? If we speak about a price which is maybe perceived as too high, or if the evidence base is maybe a bit under question, then this is basically then more going to the left-hand side, meaning that there might be maybe some controversy around that product. This is then when the kind of standard BAG, which is then the kind of standard process and the ultimate decision maker within the Swiss system is kicking in. So it starts with the kind of normal, there are templates obviously available as always in most of the systems I think we have spoken so far, and those kind of systems include the evidence base, the unmet medical need, but also quite clearly the so-called VZW criteria, and Remo will also touch base on that a bit later. That is why we are not spending a lot of time in here, but ultimately there are also quite clearly the economic aspects taken into account. We're not speaking here about, let's say, pure health economics, not cost effectiveness, as for example, we know that from a couple of other countries like the UK or some other countries, but it is a kind of, let's say, way, and quite clearly more a kind of important a point more made on the pricing side. Finally, there are three different kind of outcomes of that process. It's quite clearly, and that is where, I mean, everybody wants to get in, which means there is reimbursement. And reimbursement would basically mean this needs to be mapped into the different kind of tariff systems. You see that on the right-hand side of that slide. So depending a bit which device you have, it would basically need to be fit into one of those kind of tariff systems / lists. There's also the opportunity generally on conditional reimbursement, meaning there are, but only really very few. We just had a look, I think, mid of last year, quite detailed. And there's also a nice paper as well available. Just contact me if you want to have it, which also analyzes or has analyzed the different kind of medical devices with the conditional reimbursement. It first sounds very interesting. It's a kind of experimental coverage kind of idea, but nobody basically really sees upfront if this is potentially a pathway for the product when you enter that kind of process, meaning you basically hand your dossier, your evidence in there, you have the kind of process, you have the back and forth with the BAG, and then after years, normally, especially, I'm just speaking about that kind of small group with the conditional reimbursement, that you then get that kind of decision, which means you need to run further evidence generation, so further trials, but at the same time, you have already reimbursement during that kind of process. And finally, that's also the opportunity, and not probably opportunity, the possibility that the decision is basically a no reimbursement, which means you're excluded of the reimbursement list in Switzerland. So this is a bit the kind of environment for the medical device reimbursement. As already said, there are some specific criteria which will also touch base in the drug area again, the VZW criteria, for example, and which is also being applied for the medical device area. What about digital health? I mean, whoever was following us now on the last couple of months, or roughly already a year now, I mean, we have already had a couple of webinars on digital health applications, especially obviously in Germany, but also across Europe. In general, I think there's no separate pathway in the Swiss healthcare system in order to get reimbursement for digital health applications. But what we have had also in the discussion with the BEG is basically that through the so-called Article 25 KVG is basically meant that if there is a therapy which has a clear kind of let's say treatment opportunity or an examination for a disease and its consequences, that this is basically or should as well be part of the benefits catalog within the Swiss healthcare insurance system. And that is also where everybody was as well leading then those kind of products in the so-called Miegel list. I have mentioned that already a couple of minutes ago, but just that we quickly as well go through that as well. The Miegel list is the list for remedies and devices as well. For example, also for walking aids, right? I mean, not everywhere like in Germany, but also, for example, now just recently being launched, I think beginning of this year in Belgium, that there is a special pathway for reimbursement for digital health applications. I think Switzerland here follows more the kind of pathway as we know it, for example, as well in France, that they just simply use, I think, processes which already worked as well in order to as well apply to those kind of new digital health applications. In general, I think the whole kind of, let's say, listing exactly follows as well what we have just seen a couple of slides ago. There is a template available. You need to fill in there again the disease description, the unmet medical need, and also the evidence which is available for the product, meaning you would as well need to have quite clearly a clinical trial available, which is maybe as well a bit of the difference, I think, to Germany quite clearly, but also I think, to my understanding, to Belgium, for example, where you could also have that experimental, I call it still experimental kind of coverage while having reimbursement for especially those digital health applications. So you would first need to have the evidence. You would need to come up with a non-disputable price, I would say, which is also obviously then the kind of core question, how that would be compared to the other kind of product available within that kind of, not only the Miegel list, but I think especially also in comparison to what is currently being used in those patients in that disease area. Appraisals as well then basically done very similar as before. And then there's the decision, which is then being as well the kind of question mark what we have just had on the slide a couple of minutes ago, reimbursement, no reimbursement, and then there might be the inclusion within the Miegel list. But maybe let's now just move a bit away from the medical device, digital health area, back to pharma. And we're coming closer to, I think, Remo. We have our, let's say, we start as well again very briefly here with the entrance door, let's say, into the Swiss healthcare market. Again, also here, there is the entrance door through the so-called Swissmedic, which is basically the Swiss EMA, right? So it's the Swiss Agents for Therapeutic Products. Again, early consultation possible, and the submissions then also basically done based on different templates. I think important here is maybe, and that's maybe not a surprise, whoever has been working on different regulatory pathways, but there are also different pathways dependent a bit which kind of product, which kind of drug you have as well in your hands. So if you have, for example, a new active ingredient, or if you have, for example, a medicine which is not different to an existing one, a so-called co-marketing medicine, not to, let's say, compared to co-marketing, which is sometimes as well being seen in the business area, and then also to the so-called known active pharmaceutical ingredients. All of those have basically different kind of streams, different kind of templates as well, and that leads then as well to a decision by the Swissmedic in order to get approval to be launched in the Swiss market. I think maybe also very briefly to mention, I think it was also just being published through a press release by the Swissmedic a couple of days ago. Swissmedic has also decided to permanently be involved in the so-called Project Orbis, which I think is probably also a quite good step forward. I think especially in the oncology area, which means that Swissmedic is also taking part, that companies could now also submit at the same time their kind of regulatory submissions to different regulatory agencies. And I think this is also obviously bringing, I think, also Swiss patients potentially earlier products into the kind of use there. But before patient can use that, and this is quite clearly after the positive Swissmedic approval, you need as well to have reimbursement decision, which is again a difference to Germany, where you can launch a product already, which is available and being paid for while you do the whole kind of process. In Switzerland, it follows what I think a lot of people as well know from basically all of the other countries across the world, right? You have an approval, you need to submit for reimbursement, then you have your process, and just if you have then the positive outcome of your reimbursement submission, only then you can market and really launch then the product and patients can really use it. Before we come then to some of the specifics here, again, you see on the top of that, Swissmedic is again the entrance tool quite clearly. And then you have as well where you would need to, as an industry, as a company, you would need to submit a dossier to the so-called BAG, which is then again what I said already early on, the ultimate decision maker in the Swiss environment. Also here you have different kind of streams, which is being followed by the BAG. You have regular assessments. You have, again, also for co-marketing medicines, what I have just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, a simplified assessment, for example, but also processes, 2 different processes for known active pharmaceutical ingredients. There are different kind of timelines where you can submit. I think that's also being published on the website of the BAG across the year. And that is, I think, also where, for example, and that's maybe the first kind of question also to Remo. I think what is being published for is ideally, and if everything runs smoothly, you don't get any questions back or only very few kind of minor questions that you can really simply address it, then you could theoretically have already approval from submission to the, let's say, product on the market within 4 months after the submission. I think this is very theoretical. I think I mean, we have done quite a good number of submissions now already in the last couple of years, but I think we never really hit the 4 months. And I think, Remo, we also have just spoken beforehand. You also said, I think for new products, I think a year is a standard kind of process. But I think maybe you can as well touch base first on the timing of that, but also, I mean, what I said also early on the VZV criteria before you, and we have not yet mentioned that as well, maybe as well could speak about, I said it maybe a bit provocatively, the early paid access. And I think I know your opinion on that. So handing over
early access program, it's dangerous to say.
That's already a big difference, I think, to the terminology, right? I think Swiss do not like to hear that. So I'm happy to hand now over to you, Remo, and to the Wonderland, Switzerland, maybe.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. As you mentioned before, Swissmedic is responsible for the approval, for the authorization, and the Federal Office of Public Health for the pricing. That means 2 independent processes and authorities. There are 4 main steps. The first of all, the start of the reimbursement process. With the pre-approval of Swissmedic, the applicant can already submit the 30-page reimbursement dossier. We have only 30 pages, not more, to the Federal Office of Public Health. The second step is then the so-called Federal Drug Commission meeting, the EAK meeting. That's an extra parliamentary commission elected by the Federal Council. It's close to 16 members from different fields. They review the dossier and provide the Federal Office of Public Health with a recommendation on the benefits and the price. And the meeting usually lasts only 10 to 15 minutes. So there is not a lot of time for each dossier. Then the third step, you get a written statement of the Federal Office of Public Health. That's approximately 1 month after the EAK meeting. The Federal Office of Public Health comments on the dossier. And then an intensive negotiation process between pharma and the Federal Office of Public Health begins, I think, like in other countries. Also, the target to have a price from Federal Office of Public Health After approval by Swissmedic, it's 60 days. This 60 days rule, it can take up to 2 years, sometimes even longer, as we have seen in the past. Based on my experience, the negotiation process can involve 2 to 60 contacts. This can be phone calls, meetings, emails, or letters with the Federal Office of Public Health. When the negotiation process is over, then your product is reimbursed and it's on the specialty list and it's national-wide reimbursed, and patients have 100% access to the drug, and it's published on the positive list. Sometimes the value assessment, usually a few months later, you can also see it, and it's public. The main processes we have, as Stefan already mentioned, are the WZW criteria. These are the core elements of the price finding. And as part of the cost effectiveness criteria, we have in Switzerland the 2 core elements, the European Union reference prices and the therapeutic cross comparison, and each is weighted at 50%. For the foreign price comparison, the average of the prices of the following 9 reference countries is used. It's Germany, Austria, France, England, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. In the therapeutic cross comparison, the efficacy and the price of the new drug are compared with the drugs which are already reimbursed in Switzerland. If your new product is more effective than a conventional one, it receives, or it can receive, an innovation surcharge of maximum of 20%. And the same process is used in regular negotiations when you have new indications, new dosing, new packages, patent expiry. And we have products, we had one product in oncology, we had already more than 30 renegotiation during the life cycle of the product. Let me speak about Article 71. That's something very special in Switzerland, and we are very proud of this. This article was introduced in 2012, and the initial thought of this Article 71 was giving access to patients to classical off-label treatments of well-known established products. Obviously, there was and is a high need for such off-label treatment as today. 8 years later, about 30,000 patients a year have access via this Article 71. Besides the classical off-label treatment, a second group of patients who have a benefit from Article 71 are people who are in need of new innovative drugs which are not yet on the positive list I explained before. For these drugs, it is possible that patients have access. We call this way of access via Article 71 the so-called bridging solution or bridging specialty positive list. With this solution, patient can have access to innovative drugs already on the day of Swissmedic approval, like in Germany, or even earlier. That is the so-called early paid access program Stefan means. How does it work in general? Prerequisites are that the drug is for a life-threatening disease. There is no paid alternative on the specialty list, and there is a high therapeutic benefit is to be expected. These are very important 3 conditions you have to fulfill. If these prerequisites are met, a physician can submit a request for cost approval directly to the health insurance company. Also with Article 71, the health insurances are very important compared to the specialty list where we have the national reimbursement. There, more or less, the health insurance, they have to pay what Federal Office of Public Health tells. But in this Article 71, there are only negotiations between the payer and the pharmaceutical industry. Pragmatic benefit assessment with 4 categories, A, B, C, D, is performed. You can see on the slide. A means a high benefit, B means a substantial benefit, C means possibly benefit, and D is not benefit and means no access to the drug for the patient. Important to note that Article 71 contains a cost-sharing element between the payer and the pharmaceutical company. The lower the benefit, that's clear, the higher is the cost sharing of the pharmaceutical company. And something very special is, I really would like to highlight the benefit category C. Here, the pharmaceutical industry assumes the entire drug cost at the start of the therapy and up to the defined point in time. If the patient responds to the therapy in this setting, the health insurer shares in the costs. And that's something very special. We call it in German Therapieversuch, for drugs where the benefit is not yet clear. Especially is used for personalized drugs. And for example, Roche is the company with the most Article 71 cases. We have about 5,500 per year, of which about 90% are classic off-label use, as I mentioned in the beginning, and about 10% via this so-called early access program when you are not yet on the specialty list. But I have to mention again, this is only possible for drugs where there is no alternative, it's a life-threatening disease, and a high therapeutic benefit is expected. And I also have to emphasize again, this is a very good emergency solution for innovative drugs, and the payers there are very cooperative, but we have to do everything to improve the national reimbursement process so that this emergency early access bridging solution, or we would like to call it via this Article 71, is not really necessary. As a summary, when I compare these 2 processes, you can see on the left side, that's the Federal Office of Public Health way, the positive list. I call it the highway. And this national reimbursement process is the standard process, and the drugs should be reimbursed via this main process or this highway. Article 71 are the so-called side streets in blue. In principle, as I mentioned, for off-label treatments, but it can be also used as an emergency solution, bridging SL, for new innovative drugs that are not yet on the specialty list. There you have negotiations with the payer directly. Due to the enormous medical and scientific progress, and I think also the complexity of the treatments, the system is more and more challenged also in other countries. And it remains to be seen whether we can improve the highway or whether the network of secondary roads will become larger. And I think that off-label use anyhow will increase, and therefore in Switzerland relationship and really knowing how it works with the payers, I think it's very important and clear. That's also the future, but we try to do everything that we also have access via this standard process, via the specialty list. And I hope I could give you a quick summary and some appetizers for the beautiful, pragmatic Swiss system. I like things more than 30 years.
Yes, that's perfect, Remo. That was a good kind of summary, I think, also on the different aspects and drivers of, as you call it, the highway, but I think also very good kind of insights already on the side streets for the drugs according to Article 71, which brings me already to the conclusion. I think, I mean, we have obviously put that a bit provocative in there with the Wonderland Switzerland, I think, as obviously, and I think quite clearly any kind of process and system, I think it has its pitfalls, but also its opportunities. But I think in general, and that is, I think, where I personally also see the cultural aspect probably also kicking in into the process, is that the Swiss market access process is probably a bit more pragmatic that most, I would even say most of the other processes, I think we have at least in Europe. I think this can be seen with, I think, what Remo already said through the, for example, Article 71. I think this is a quite pragmatic process. And I think also quite interestingly, when thinking about off-label, or as you call it, the bridging solution, as I maybe said it, the early paid access program. I mean, there's also that part of the cost sharing in there, right? But this also shows a bit that kind of, I think, a flexibility or pragmatism, I think, within the system, which I think, again, and work very close to the Swiss border, shows as well the culture, I think, within Switzerland. But I think also when you take the other kind of different pathways, when we have spoken about the Swissmedic, but also with the BAG, with the different kind of streams there, I think there's always that kind of pragmatism, I think, somewhere, and sometimes a bit more difficult. But I think in general, I think also when you go into those negotiations, I think you always see that I think there's always, I think, the willingness to find a solution. And that's, I think, also based on, I think, the WZW criteria, which I think can also be used and applied pragmatically if wanted. But I think that's at least the kind of feedback and the kind of experience we have. And I think, Remo, I know you, but I think after 30 years of Swiss market access, or let's say healthcare experience, I think you would probably agree as well, right?
Yeah, you know, Swiss people, we are very proud that we are a small country and that we know each other. I think that's also something special in Switzerland. And we have a great willingness to engage in dialogue and find pragmatic solutions. Sometimes maybe it lasts a little bit longer than in other countries, but then in the end, it's a compromise and everybody is happy and nobody loses somehow the face. And I think that's really something characteristic in Switzerland. But I know also other countries have beauties, not only Switzerland.
No, of course. We have not said that other countries are not having pragmatic, let's say, worse process, right? We're just focusing here on the Swiss process, which I think is, again, I think let's say a challenging one, but I think also one where I think you can as well find solutions. Perfect. I think back to you, Lutz.
Wonderful. Thank you, Remo, for this wonderful insights, and welcome. Thank you, Stefan, for all this valuable information. Yes, we have plenty feedback from our audience and a lot of questions, actually. So the first questions, couple of questions, are about the BAG process, about the dossier and the price and the reassessment. So the first question is about the reassessment after 36 months. Is this just a full assessment, or is it a simplified or a shorter version?
Yeah, it depends. When it's a new product, normally you have a limited reimbursement, and then it's the same process like the first application. Normally you have a conditional reimbursement. But when you have older products, they are 5-10 years on the market, you have these 3 yearly reviews. and they are quite pragmatic. You have the therapeutic comparison and the reference price, but you do not have to send the full dossiers. Full dossier. But for innovative drugs, you can have not to underestimate the renegotiations all the time. Sometimes you have a conditional reimbursement only for 1 year, maybe when not all the reference countries are on the market or the data are not clear. And there is still some room for negotiation. But all new products, they have limited reimbursement. So even when they have pricing models, we have in Switzerland quite a lot, you can be sure that you have a conditional reimbursement and renegotiations, tough renegotiations again.
Thank you. And then the next question is about the foreign price comparison. Which price levels are considered? And are these the same price levels like ex-factory price, public price, pharmacy prices, or does this differ?
It's the FAP, also how it's called in
the factory Abgabe.
Ex-factory, yeah, sorry, the ex-factory price. But the Federal Office of Public Health, they know that these are not often not the normal prices. There are some discounts, like in England, for example. And therefore, your price in the end, it's mostly always a little bit lower than the reference price based on the ex-factory. And the main challenge we have is not the reference price, it's the therapeutic comparison. When you have a new drug and you have to compare with older drugs, then you have quite a problem that you get the level of the reference price. These are the main difficulty we have is the therapeutic comparison, and you have to try to do everything that you do not have to compare with older drugs. When you have maybe since 30 years, there is no innovation, you have a chance that you don't have to be compared with an older drug.
Which is already there, like in a generic way, really old, really low price level, right?
Yeah. But the good thing is the therapeutic comparison is not so clear. There is more room for interpretation when you compare maybe with Germany. In some cases, these cases can be good, but on the other hand, it maybe sometimes it's bad. But you have still room for negotiation. You have a law, there is a framework, but the framework is more flexible. I call it maybe more flexible.
Yeah, and I mean, if I could also quickly add, I think there's another flexibility, I think, within the system, right? I mean, if you have an innovative, a new ingredient being launched, and there's only, let's say, generic products available as well, at least within that basket, right? There's also, I think, the opportunity in some circumstances that even the price before the generic price was being available could be taken into consideration in the pricing formula. I think that's maybe as well showing, again, a bit of the pragmatism, I think, within the system. But in general, I agree. I think it's those kind of two, let's say, parts, which is sometimes one of those components is basically having maybe, or let's say, bring maybe as well the final price down further.
That's a very good point. When you have a new drug and you have to compare with patent loss products, they lost the patent. There is a law that you can take the price of these patent lost products, the price before you lost the patent, and then you have a higher therapeutic comparison. Yeah.
I have a question also here from the audience. Does the Brexit already play a role in that international price comparison? Because it's not longer part of the EU. The other
so far it's still England. It's still the Great Britain, and the reference basket sometimes it can change, but the reference basket is quite stable for years.
Yeah, and maybe just to add here, right? I think the kind of basket in Switzerland is not based on the European Union. It's more based, I think, on other aspects. I think to also have, let's say, kind of comparable kind of countries as well to be taken into account. And I think England is probably there still a driver, I think, besides the other countries you have just mentioned.
Yeah. And then there's a nice theoretic question, actually. What happens with the pricing formula calculation if there is no therapeutic cross comparison, and also it's Switzerland is the first country in Europe where it's launched?
That's a big challenge. Then you have to be a good negotiation. That's really difficult, and in most of the cases, you have to wait for the first country that there is a reference price, and that helps. But then you have a conditional reimbursement till you have maybe 3 or 4 other countries. And when you have not a reference price and you have no therapeutic comparison, then it's very difficult. But then maybe it's easier with Article 71 when you really have an innovation. Then this way helps you that patients have access on an individual base. I also have to mention Article 71 is on an individual base. It's not that you have a contract with the payers and then all the patients get through, because the system says that there is the efficacy have to be tested, but also the patient characteristics. Is it important that the patient needs the drug or not? But when you have neither the therapeutic comparison or the reference price, that you have access via the specialty list, maybe in my career, the last 30 years, there's maybe one case. Or 10, 15 years ago, it was easier. But nowadays, I think it's difficult. I think it's not possible. But you have this Article 71, and there it's even possible that you can have access on a single base case before you have the approval. And that's the beauty for the patient in a very specific situation. Because then the payers are more flexible, or the law is more flexible than the law via the specialty list.
But it also depends obviously on the price level, right? I mean, if the price level is maybe not too high, I think there might also be the opportunity that, for example, the reimbursement is just limited for a year. Because I mean, after a year, I think it is assumed that most of the as well foreign prices are then available. But I mean, we have now all just assumed that we're speaking about the kind of quite premium prices, right?
When you really have a good product and there is no therapeutic comparison, and you also accept, because you know by law, Article 71, you have to give a discount. That's by law. And the more open you try everything that the patients have access, then you have a good chance that the patients get the product. But it's clear it depends also on the price, on also the willingness of the pharmaceutical industry, how open you are for a compromise. It depends on the mentality of the company.
Yeah. Will the Article 71 drugs later also be subject for the regular assessment at the BAG? Or can I go like endless over the Article 71?
At the moment, it's endless, but there is a lot of pressure that this is not possible anymore. And I think that's also right, because it's a bridging solution.
Yeah.
And what is really not good, some companies, they don't go via the specialty list. They go only via Article 71. And I think this does not help the system, and does really not. It helps that maybe for the company, the drug can be sold, but it does not help the system. And therefore, I personally, or we do all the time, we try the specialty list, and we have this bridging solution with this, I say maybe double strategy.
Exactly.
But to go only Article 71, that's really bad, because then you trick the system and then it does not help.
Yeah.
There's also some.
Yeah, no, maybe just very, very quickly as well, just again to add, right? I think the just keeping in mind, I mean, to what Remo as well just said, I mean, when you submit your case to the BEG, it's basically that the process starts, but the product is not yet available, right? And that's basically then also where you said it, that the bridging patients could already get access to it based on the criteria you have just said. So if you have a good product and the criteria basically apply, then you can utilize that. But I think the idea of the system in general, and that's also what we hear back from Swiss payers as well, is that the regular pathway is being done, that you go into the kind of negotiation with the BAG, and during that phase, yes, then they're as well open and willing to go through that kind of bridging solution. But ultimately, that should just be a bridging, not a kind of final reimbursement solution. I think that's important to mention.
And don't forget, when you go via the highway, the specialty list, all patients have access.
Yeah.
And when you go via Article 71, okay, when you have really a good product, then almost all patients have access, but it's still an individual case-by-case negotiation. You can have contracts with the payers on the value that you can discuss the price already, but it's even the medical officer has to decide also by law if it makes sense for this specific patient or not. And therefore you have a limited access compared to the specialty list. But it helps for this really bridging situation that patients have access.
Okay, staying at the Article 71, are medical devices also applicable for over Article 71 to bridge that?
No, it's only for drugs.
Only for drugs. Okay. And then we stay at the medical devices. Regarding medical devices for inpatient use, what is your perspective on the reimbursement of new innovative medical devices within the DRG system, with regards like of pricing opportunities, incorporation of price into existing DRG codes and stuff?
I guess that's probably the kind of issue with any kind of DRG system, right? I think our experience probably that it is quite fragmented, or let's say quite inflexible, I would even say, right? I think for medical device, I think if you want especially to go just through the kind of DRG system itself and to get it through, let's say, within an existing DRG value, I think it's getting quite difficult. But obviously, I mean, as we already said, I think there are also those opportunities, I think, that you could as well submit, let's say, for additional fundings as well. Which is then a bit easier. But again, also there you need to apply, obviously, and you need to see basically whether you apply to the different criteria. I think, I mean, otherwise, I think in innovation, I think, or let's put it that way, I think if you have an innovative product which also shows a benefit, I think there would be always as well ways to find a funding opportunity, I think also within those kind of systems. I think that's, again, the kind of probably pragmatism as well within the Swiss healthcare system.
Thank you, Stefan. There's two more questions I have here on my list, which is, one is, what is the process for investigating existing reimbursement codes that could be used for telemedicine devices, if there is one? If there is one code, right? There's not a code yet.
No, but I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's always the same kind of, let's say, endeavor, right? You're basically checking the different tariffs and just see which ones basically fit to the product you have, right? Independent whether it's a telemedicine or a digital or a medical device product, right? I think you need to know where it's being applied for, where it's being used for, which indication and which tariff it might basically be leading to. And then you can obviously check whether coding is available.
And then I want to finish here with one question to Remo, especially. I think that's a good friend from Switzerland, because it's explicitly to you. What are best practices when negotiating with a BAG? Any advice? Many thanks.
Yeah, that's Michael. I know him very well. What shall I say? I think, first of all, never give up and try to really understand them, because you get something written and then the whole company gets nervous because they do not appreciate your product and you get angry. Let it be, try to email or call and try having a dialogue that you really understand the problem. And they are not enemies, and you have to treat them not like friends, but you do not have to be arrogant and frustrated. Try really to understand their opinion, because they have the right to think different than you. And when you learn this, I think then you can understand them, and then I think in 95% or 99% of my cases or our cases, we find a solution. And it depends also on you that you give in sometimes you are hard. And yeah, I think most important, don't be arrogant, because you know the pharmaceutical industry, how we are, what people think of us, and do everything to be also somehow maybe a human being, and try to understand that they have the right, that maybe the price is too high. And I think these are the best practice, or I think it's the mentality, the dialogue, you also the payers, they think different than you, they have to think different than you, but learn and be maybe courageous, why they think like this. And then I think it opens also your mind, and when you understand the payers and also the Federal Office of Public Health, and they have the right to be different, then I think that the way is open to find solutions. But sometimes it's also frustrating. I mean, sometimes I'm also frustrated, but after long negotiation and you find a way that you have access, then you are also very proud, and you learn out of this, and it also gives somehow a relationship over the time. And this is at least it's my approach. No, I also had to learn this 20 years ago. I made it in a different way. That's clear. No, the older you get also a little bit more patient.
I think maybe I think, just to add, I think to what you said, Remo, I think it's probably also important to anticipate what might maybe come, because there might be, especially if you have new product, new innovative product, there is not just that you submit and they simply accept it. They will question a lot of things, obviously, starting with the evidence, going over to the price, to what you have submitted for your economic component as well. But I think it's also anticipation that you also, let's say, try to play that game, right? That you give them something that they can as well accept, but you would as well, I think the most important thing is also, as you said, you need to understand them, right? Where they're coming from, because then you could also try to, let's say, fulfill as well their kind of needs, right? Because also that person needs to obviously argue to their bosses that this is something what we can now accept. I mean, you said something very important a couple of minutes ago, nobody loses its face, right? And that needs to come out there. But I think that's also probably managing the internal expectations, especially if companies are not coming out of the Swiss environment, sometimes from the US, sometimes from other countries where, you know, it's maybe a bit more pushy, right? You need to be a bit calm, you need to be cautious, you need to anticipate, you need to play that game of get probably give and take, right?
Perfect.
And I mean, it also depends. Maybe it also depends on the company. I think sometimes I also was in other companies, you have to fight more with headquarters than with the payers.
Exactly.
This is also something. Sometimes, you have to fight on different levels, and
That's true. I fully agree, Remo. Okay, perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you all for this wonderful discussions. There's one last question. We have many feedback here from the audience. Thank you very much all for this. One last question: which Swiss cheese is now the best?
Remy, I'll leave that to you.
What's your favorite? A Gruyere?
Pardon, I didn't. I couldn't hear your question.
Which cheese is now the best? Which Swiss cheese?
This depends. At the moment, it's raclette when it's cold and fondue. But I personally like Tilsit. Okay. But all the cheeses are good in Switzerland. They are the best. I mean, everybody knows, not only the Swiss.
Exactly.
I agree.
Also the mice. Okay. Let us finish tonight. Thank you all for joining us here. And I think that the registrations are already open for our next webinar, which is 10 years of AMNOG, the German process here for the pricing, the early benefit assessment we have here. It's 10 years old now. And what have we learned for drug development and pricing? And we have a special guest then there in 1 month on March 25th, Professor Dr. Thomas Hammerschmidt from the University Rosenheim. So go on our website or go to our LinkedIn webpage and register for that webinar. So once again, thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Remo, for this wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Stay healthy, all in these COVID times now here, and have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.
Thank you, Lutz. Thank you, Remo.
Thank you
Thank you,
very
everybody.
much.
Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.